It was a quiet morning, the kind where the sun stretches lazily over the houses and the air feels calm and soft. The protagonist had just stepped out of the house, coffee in hand, ready to start the day with some peace and routine. But the moment the driveway came into view, that peace shattered. There it was again, Karen's car, parked smack in the middle of the driveway, blocking any chance of leaving without a battle. This wasn't the first time. Karen had a habit, almost like a ritual, of parking wherever she pleased, as if the driveway belonged solely to her. The protagonist had tried to be patient, tried to be polite, even tried humor. Notes on windshields, a gentle tap on the window, even a friendly wave and suggestion, but it never worked. Karen seemed immune to reason, her mind set firmly on doing what she wanted and no one else mattered. The first time it happened, the protagonist had been late for work. The car was blocking the path and there was no space to maneuver around. A deep breath, a polite knock on her window, and a careful explanation were met with a shrug and a dismissive wave. "I'm just popping in for a second," she had said, as if seconds could be measured by how inconvenienced someone else felt. Neighbors had noticed too. Some whispered about her, shaking their heads behind curtains, but no one wanted to confront her directly. The protagonist learned quickly that arguing or trying to make her understand usually ended with more frustration. Once she had called the police over a minor misunderstanding, claiming harassment, and the whole thing turned into a tedious investigation before it was quietly closed. That was the first seed of realization. Karen didn't respond to politeness or reason. Something else would be needed. Weeks passed and her habit only grew bolder. Sometimes it was early in the morning, sometimes late at night. The protagonist began to dread stepping outside, unsure of whether the car would be gone or whether yet another confrontation awaited. Work, errands, friends' plans, everything had to be adjusted around Karen's unpredictability. The simple act of leaving the house became a mental exercise, strategizing exits, avoiding confrontation, and hoping that today might be different. The protagonist started keeping a small notebook. Each incident was recorded, noting the time, the inconvenience, and Karen's response. It became almost a log of absurdity, a private diary of suburban warfare. Friends who visited found it funny at first, reading entries with exaggerated sighs and dramatic gestures. But behind the humor was real frustration. It was exhausting to live under the shadow of someone else's carelessness, especially when it felt deliberate. One afternoon, after yet another morning wasted on trying to maneuver around Karen's car, the protagonist sat on the porch and thought, maybe there had to be a better way. Notes and polite requests hadn't worked. Complaining to neighbors didn't help. Even getting minor authority involvement was more trouble than it was worth. Something creative, something undeniable, seemed like the only solution. It wasn't just about convenience. It was about reclaiming control. About being able to step outside without wondering if a battle awaited. The protagonist thought of all the times she had felt helpless, trapped by someone else's disregard. There was a slow-burning realization that maybe politeness wasn't enough. Sometimes life required a firmer hand, or in this case, a clever plan. She started taking walks around the neighborhood more often, studying spaces, noticing how others handled similar annoyances. There were driveways blocked by delivery trucks, mail carriers' vans, even a few cars parked in no parking zones. Sometimes homeowners had cones or small decorative fences, but nothing permanent, nothing strong enough to withstand someone like Karen. The protagonist needed something different. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops one evening, an idea started to take shape. Something big, something noticeable, and above all, something Karen couldn't ignore. The protagonist imagined massive planters, heavy and sturdy, positioned just right. They would be functional, could double as landscaping, and would make it impossible for the car to block the driveway again. It was a bold idea, and the thought of it made the protagonist smile. Maybe, just maybe, this was the solution she had been looking for. The idea grew in her mind over the next few days. Measurements were taken, the types of plants considered, the visual appeal calculated. It wasn't just about stopping Karen. It was about doing it in a way that felt fair, legal, and even a little beautiful. The planters would serve as both a deterrent and an enhancement to the property. The protagonist wanted something undeniable, something that would end the endless cycle of confrontation. Friends were told about the plan. Some laughed, imagining giant planters blocking a driveway, and some nodded seriously. recognizing the creativity and determination behind it. The protagonist started looking online, researching sizes, weights, and designs. It became a project, a mission, and a source of quiet satisfaction. For once, she felt in control, plotting a solution that was clever rather than confrontational. Meanwhile, Karen continued her usual routine, oblivious to the brewing plan. The protagonist watched, noting the timings, the patterns. Karen's arrogance was predictable, and that predictability was a strength now. There was a sense of anticipation, a quiet thrill at the thought of finally having a strategy that could match Karen's audacity. Evenings became sessions of planning. The protagonist visualized the placement of the planters, imagined Karen's reaction, and refined the approach. It was a mix of tactical thinking and creative design, making sure the planters were strong, visually appealing, and perfectly positioned. It was a balance of practicality and subtle artistry, ensuring that the solution was both effective and harmonious with the neighborhood aesthetic. During this time, the protagonist also reflected on the emotional toll Karen had caused. The constant stress, the minor daily battles, the sense of unpredictability, it had worn on her patience. But now, with a clear plan in mind, there was a renewed sense of purpose. The frustration was transforming into action, and the action into anticipation. Each day brought the plan closer to reality. Each blocked driveway became a reminder that change was coming. The first part of the plan was to measure, to understand the space and the weight requirements. The protagonist spent afternoons taking notes, sometimes lying down to check angles, sometimes stepping back to see the full view. Every detail mattered. The placement had to be perfect, ensuring both functionality and aesthetic appeal. It was a meticulous process, one that required patience, but the thought of finally stopping Karen's habitual blocking made every detail worthwhile. As the week ended, the protagonist had a clear blueprint. The planters would be massive, sturdy, and immovable. They would stand as a barrier, a statement, and a solution. There was a sense of satisfaction in knowing that for once, the frustration and helplessness could be transformed into action. The plan wasn't just about blocking a car. It was about reclaiming peace, establishing boundaries, and finally taking control. The stage was set. The anticipation hung in the air, mingling with the warm evening breeze. Karen, unaware of the impending change, continued her routine. The protagonist, meanwhile, felt a mix of excitement, nervousness, and quiet satisfaction. The first step toward resolution had been taken, and nothing would be the same again. It was the calm before the storm, a moment of preparation, and the start of a plan that would change everything. And so, the protagonist stood on the porch one last time that evening, sipping a cup of tea, feeling the cool air on her face, and thinking about the days ahead. The planters were coming, the solution was near, and the endless cycle of frustration was about to end. Patience, observation, and creativity had brought her to this point. Tomorrow, the first step toward reclaiming her driveway would begin, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The next morning, the protagonist woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The planters had been ordered, and their arrival was only a few days away. There was a strange mix of excitement and anxiety bubbling inside, as if the whole neighborhood would soon notice a change, whether they liked it or not. She took her usual cup of coffee outside, looking at the driveway and imagining the massive planters in their future spots. Already, the mind could see Karen's confusion, her sputtering frustration, the unstoppable inevitability of what was about to happen. Over the next few days, the protagonist prepared meticulously. She measured the driveway several times, checking angles, spacing, and placement. Every detail was critical. The planters couldn't be too close together to make the space look cluttered, but they had to be close enough to prevent any car from slipping through. There were small adjustments, shifting imaginary lines with sticks, marking spots with chalk, testing visibility from all angles. It was oddly satisfying work, combining planning with anticipation. Neighbors began to notice her unusual activity. Some waved politely, others watched curiously. One older woman from across the street came over, leaning on her cane, asking with genuine interest about what was going on. The protagonist smiled, explaining vaguely that she was sprucing up the driveway. She didn't reveal the full plan yet. There was a quiet satisfaction in having this secret, a private triumph slowly unfolding while the neighborhood remained unaware of the real purpose. Delivery day arrived, and with it came a mix of chaos and relief. The planters were enormous, heavier than the protagonist had imagined, each one requiring careful handling. A team of movers had to lift and place them, measuring repeatedly, adjusting angles, and double-checking stability. There were moments of awkward fumbling, near collisions and minor scratches, but gradually, one by one, the planters began to find their positions. The protagonist supervised with keen attention, ensuring each planter was placed exactly where it needed to be. Sweat dripped. Hands grew tired from gestures and pointing, but the mind was focused, imagining Karen's inevitable reaction. There was humor in the physical struggle, but also a sense of accomplishment in seeing the vision come alive. By mid-afternoon, the planters stood firm, large and immovable. The driveway now clearly demarcated and protected. It was almost poetic to see them there, like silent sentinels guarding the space. Each planter was carefully chosen, filled with vibrant greenery, flowers that added color, and ornamental stones for stability. The protagonist stepped back, feeling a wave of pride. Not only were the planters functional, but they were aesthetically pleasing, enhancing the curb appeal of the property. It was a combination of necessity and beauty, a creative solution to a long-standing problem. The first encounter with Karen after the planters were in place was inevitable. She appeared that evening, arriving with her usual sense of entitlement. The protagonist could see her from the kitchen window, parking on the street nearby, her eyes scanning the driveway. Confusion, disbelief, and finally frustration flickered across her face as she noticed the massive barriers now occupying the space she had once taken for granted. Karen circled the car, tapping the steering wheel, muttering under her breath, trying to gauge a way through. She rolled down the window, shouting questions and complaints, but the protagonist remained calm, stepping outside with a neutral expression. No argument, no harsh words, just the steady presence of someone who had finally set boundaries. Karen's words bounced off like air, her usual power over the protagonist ineffective against the silent, immovable planters. This first confrontation was short but telling. Karen tried various maneuvers, inching the car forward, attempting to squeeze past, but the planters held firm. There was no way around them. Frustration grew on her face, turning into a resigned glare. The protagonist said nothing, only watched with quiet satisfaction, feeling a sense of relief that the long cycle of confrontation might finally be over. Over the next few days, Karen continued to test her limits. She called friends over, asking for advice, made plans to contact authorities, and even tried to find ways to remove the planters herself, but each attempt failed. The protagonist handled everything calmly, never escalating, never responding with anger. The power of the planters lay not just in their physical presence, but in the quiet assertion of boundaries. Karen's usual tactics were rendered useless, and the protagonist enjoyed a small, private triumph each time her schemes were thwarted. Neighbors began to take notice as well. Some admired the boldness, others simply enjoyed watching the slow unraveling of Karen's frustration. The protagonist became a subtle hero in the neighborhood, the person who had found a clever solution without conflict, maintaining peace while reclaiming personal space. The small, quiet satisfaction of taking control in a non-aggressive way resonated with many. Throughout this period, the protagonist reflected on the experience. The constant stress, the repeated disruptions, and the feeling of helplessness had been draining. But the solution had been a mix of creativity, patience, and careful planning. It wasn't about revenge or escalation. It was about taking control of a situation that had long been dominated by someone else's disregard. There was a lesson in assertiveness, in clever problem-solving, and in the quiet power of preparation. Evenings became moments of reflection. Sitting on the porch, the protagonist would watch Karen from a distance, her car parked awkwardly on the street, and smile quietly. There was humor in the absurdity of the situation, but also a deep sense of satisfaction in the effectiveness of a well-thought-out plan. The planters weren't just physical objects. They were symbols of boundaries, patience, and ingenuity. At work and in daily life, the protagonist felt lighter, less burdened by the constant anxiety of confrontation. There was freedom in knowing that the driveway was secure, that daily routines could proceed without the looming threat of obstruction. The mental relief was as significant as the physical solution. Even friends and family noticed the change, commenting on the lighter mood, the quiet confidence that had returned. Despite the victory, there were moments of reflection on human nature. Karen's entitlement, stubbornness, and disregard for others were frustrating, but they were also a reminder of how patience and planning could overcome obstacles. It wasn't about cruelty or competition. It was about reclaiming control in a way that respected both oneself and the community. The protagonist understood that confrontation could be messy and draining, but creativity, cleverness, and composure could achieve results without conflict. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood adapted. The planters became a natural part of the landscape, admired for their beauty as much as respected for their effectiveness. Karen's attempts faded, her energy spent, her frustration redirected elsewhere. The protagonist had transformed a long-standing nuisance into an opportunity for creativity, control, and subtle humor. It was a small triumph, but meaningful in a world where small victories often mattered most. And so, life began to return to a quieter rhythm. The driveway was secure, the stress reduced, and the sense of helplessness replaced with empowerment. The protagonist could step outside in the morning without dread, enjoy a cup of coffee without tension, and look at the planters with quiet pride. They were more than just objects. They were a testament to careful planning, patience, and the simple power of standing one's ground in a clever, non-confrontational way. The first part of the plan had been executed, the immediate challenge overcome, and the neighborhood had witnessed a subtle but significant shift. The protagonist's life had changed, not through conflict but through ingenuity, patience, and quiet determination. The planters had done their job, and Karen's repeated interference had been neutralized. It was a lesson in human ingenuity, and the small victories that could shape daily life in meaningful ways. Life for now was calm, orderly, and satisfying, a direct result of foresight and creativity, and the protagonist felt ready for whatever came next. Days turned into weeks, and the presence of the massive planters began to assert a new normal in the neighborhood. The protagonist felt a sense of accomplishment each morning when stepping outside. For the first time in months, there was no anxiety about whether the driveway would be blocked, or if she would have to face Karen's usual outburst. Yet Karen was not someone to back down easily. The planters had thwarted her initial attempts, but her pride and determination were still at play. Karen started trying new tactics. She parked on the street directly in front of the driveway, hoping to intimidate or inconvenience the protagonist. She left notes with sarcastic comments about how the driveway was ruined or unusable. She even made calls asking if the planters could be removed because they were blocking her usual path. The protagonist responded calmly each time, explaining politely that the planters were legal, carefully placed, and designed to protect the driveway. There was no escalation, no anger, only a firm, composed stance. This calmness frustrated Karen further. One afternoon, Karen arrived with her car fully loaded, trying to maneuver into a position that might allow her to block the driveway despite the planters. She circled the area, reversing and inching forward only to be stopped each time by the physical barrier of the planters. Her frustration grew visible, her face tightening, hands gripping the steering wheel, muttering complaints under her breath. Neighbors watching from across the street could not help but smile at the futile efforts. The protagonist, standing on the porch, maintained a neutral expression, observing with quiet satisfaction. There was no joy in confrontation, only relief that the problem was being solved without conflict. Karen's next attempt was to call local authorities, claiming that the planters were an obstruction and unsafe. The protagonist welcomed the call, providing clear documentation. The planters were on private property, properly secured, and added aesthetic value. The authorities reviewed the situation and confirmed that the planters were perfectly legal. Karen left, defeated but still simmering with resentment. The protagonist felt a quiet thrill of validation. Patience, preparation, and a well-thought-out plan had not only solved the problem but had also maintained a respectful, legal approach. Neighbors began to talk more openly about the planters. Some expressed admiration for the creativity and composure. Others offered suggestions such as adding small signs to make the design more visible, or including extra plants for color. The protagonist appreciated the input, but preferred to maintain the original vision. It was effective, simple, and functional. The sense of control, the ability to act decisively without aggression, resonated strongly. There was a subtle joy in taking ownership of the situation without losing composure or moral ground. Karen did not give up easily. She tried sneaky tactics, hoping the protagonist might be away or distracted. She would leave her car at odd angles, sometimes late at night, hoping to make access to the driveway impossible in the morning. However, each attempt failed. The planters were strategically placed, immovable, and carefully considered. Even when Karen thought she might have found a loophole, the physical barrier proved impossible to bypass. The protagonist's foresight had turned the tables completely, creating a situation where Karen's usual tactics were nullified. One day, Karen attempted to enlist a friend to help her move the planters. She arrived with someone in a small truck, thinking that together they could shift the weighty objects. The protagonist witnessed this from a distance and calmly approached. There was no yelling or confrontation, only a polite but firm explanation that the planters were on private property and could not be moved without permission. Karen argued, trying to assert authority or create pressure, but the protagonist's calmness, backed by legality and preparation, left her friend hesitant and eventually departing without achieving anything. Over time, Karen's frustration started to take a toll on her demeanor. She was less energetic, more visibly annoyed, and increasingly resigned to the reality of the planters. The protagonist noticed subtle changes in her behavior: shorter visits, less aggressive parking, and more muted complaints. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. The silent assertion of boundaries through clever design had worn down her resistance. The protagonist understood that true power often lay not in confrontation, but in preparation, calm execution, and consistency. As weeks passed, the neighborhood began to adapt to the new reality. The planters, once a source of curiosity, became a part of the landscape. Children played nearby, adults admired the greenery, and the driveway itself became functional and respected. Karen's attempts to disrupt the space were no longer frequent. Her energy had been spent, her pride challenged, and her usual tactics rendered ineffective. The protagonist's approach demonstrated the effectiveness of clever, peaceful problem-solving, and neighbors quietly took notice. The protagonist also reflected on the personal growth experienced through this process. The constant stress of dealing with a difficult neighbor had been draining, but overcoming the challenge without aggression brought a new sense of confidence. There was an awareness that assertiveness didn't require confrontation, and that creativity and patience could achieve results that anger or retaliation never could. The planters were more than just physical barriers. They symbolized boundaries, persistence, and strategic thinking. Karen's reduced presence created a sense of calm throughout the neighborhood. The protagonist could enjoy the driveway, enter and exit without tension, and watch life unfold with a sense of satisfaction. There were moments of humor, too, in remembering her futile attempts and observing her occasional frustrated glances from across the street. The absurdity of her stubbornness and the protagonist's clever solution offered subtle amusement without needing to escalate conflict. The quiet triumph reinforced the lesson that intelligence, patience, and a well-executed plan could succeed where confrontation often fails. During this period, the protagonist also began thinking about broader applications of this approach. The driveway situation had been resolved, but the principles applied: careful observation, planning, and calm execution. Challenges, whether personal or professional, could be addressed in similar ways. There was a sense of empowerment in realizing that patience and creativity could solve persistent problems. The experience became a template for handling difficult interactions, not with aggression but with strategy and thoughtfulness. The physical presence of the planters had transformed the space. They were sturdy, visually appealing, and fully functional. The vibrant plants added beauty to the neighborhood, and the clear boundaries reassured everyone that private property was respected. The protagonist often stood on the porch, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the driveway, and feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about preventing inconvenience. It was about creating a harmonious space while maintaining personal dignity and authority. Even Karen, in moments of rare reflection, had to acknowledge the futility of her efforts. Though never openly admitted, the reality was clear. The driveway could no longer be dominated by her will. The protagonist had achieved control through calm, creative action, demonstrating that intelligence and preparation often trump stubbornness and entitlement. It was a subtle victory, one that reinforced self-respect and quiet confidence. Neighbors, too, noticed the change. Some approached the protagonist with compliments, expressing admiration for handling the situation with tact. Others shared their own small stories of neighborhood frustrations, grateful for the example set. The protagonist remained humble, focusing on the practical solution and the peace it brought, understanding that influence often came not from boasting, but from quiet, effective action. The story of the driveway and the planters spread slowly but surely. It became a small legend in the neighborhood, an example of clever problem-solving. People admired the strategy, the patience, and the calmness that had led to success. The protagonist's approach was remembered not for confrontation, but for ingenuity, demonstrating the power of preparation and quiet determination in overcoming persistent challenges. As the season changed, the planters remained strong, the driveway functional, and the neighborhood peaceful. Karen, now less confrontational, adjusted her routines, and the protagonist continued to enjoy the calm that had been achieved. The planters were more than obstacles. They were symbols of resolve, creativity, and the triumph of clever strategy over persistent frustration. Looking back, the protagonist realized the journey had been more than about a blocked driveway. It was about patience, planning, and the ability to act decisively without anger. Each step, from observation to implementation, had reinforced important lessons about human interaction and the quiet power of creative problem-solving. The driveway was now not only functional, but also a testament to perseverance, foresight, and calm determination. Life returned to a comfortable rhythm. The driveway was no longer a source of tension, the neighborhood adjusted to the new reality, and the protagonist could move through daily life with confidence and ease. The planters stood tall and firm, a constant reminder that patience, creativity, and calm assertiveness could overcome even the most frustrating challenges. The experience left a lasting impression, not just on the driveway or on Karen, but on the protagonist's sense of empowerment and ability to navigate difficult situations thoughtfully and successfully. Karen had become increasingly restless, her frustration simmering just below the surface. The planters, immovable and perfectly placed, had effectively neutralized her power over the driveway. But Karen was not one to accept defeat gracefully. She started plotting new ways to assert herself, trying to find loopholes, calling friends, and even considering legal advice. The protagonist, aware of Karen's persistence, remained calm, observing and preparing for any new attempts without allowing tension to take over. One morning, Karen arrived with a small group of friends, hoping to intimidate the protagonist into moving the planters. They circled the driveway, pointing and whispering, trying to create pressure. The protagonist approached calmly, explaining again that the planters were on private property, legal and secured properly. There was no argument, no confrontation, just firm explanation. Karen tried to escalate verbally, but her friends, seeing the calm and legality of the situation, eventually left with her, unable to achieve anything. The protagonist watched silently, feeling a quiet satisfaction at the success of strategic planning and patience. Karen's attempts became more creative and desperate. She tried blocking the street in front of the driveway, hoping to inconvenience the protagonist indirectly. She left sarcastic notes, posted complaints online, and tried to make neighbors question the legality of the planters. Each time the protagonist responded with calm logic, patience, and clear explanation. There was no escalation, only the steady maintenance of boundaries and respect for the law. Karen's usual tactics were ineffective, and her frustration grew with each failed attempt. The neighborhood began to notice the ongoing drama. Some people admired the protagonist's clever approach. Others were simply amused by Karen's futile efforts. The planters had become a symbol of ingenuity and quiet power. Neighbors started to respect the protagonist not just for reclaiming the driveway, but for doing so without conflict. Conversations around the block often included mentions of the clever solution, the patience and the quiet confidence demonstrated. The protagonist's example became a subtle lesson in handling persistent challenges thoughtfully. Karen tried calling local authorities multiple times, claiming the planters were unsafe and obstructive. The protagonist provided clear documentation each time, showing that the planters were on private property, legal, and carefully secured. The authorities consistently confirmed the legality and safety of the planters, leaving Karen visibly frustrated. Her efforts to escalate the situation legally had failed, and the protagonist continued to maintain composure, reinforcing the lesson that patience and preparedness often succeed where aggression and complaint fail. As weeks passed, Karen's presence in front of the driveway decreased. Her energy and determination had been spent, and her attempts to manipulate the situation became less frequent. The protagonist noticed a change not only in Karen's behavior, but also in the neighborhood dynamic. There was more calm, more respect, and a subtle acknowledgement that boundaries could be enforced creatively without conflict. The planters were not just objects. They were a symbol of assertiveness, patience, and clever problem-solving. The protagonist reflected on the emotional journey through this period. The stress and frustration caused by Karen's repeated interference had been significant. Yet, overcoming the challenge through strategy and calm determination had been empowering. There was a sense of personal growth, a realization that problems could be addressed thoughtfully, without confrontation, and still achieve lasting results. The driveway, once a source of anxiety, had become a space of empowerment and calm. Neighbors occasionally offered advice or small suggestions to improve the driveway's appearance further. Some recommended additional plants, decorative stones, or subtle signage. The protagonist considered these ideas but remained focused on the original goal: maintaining a functional, aesthetically pleasing space that prevented future issues. Each addition, adjustment, or change was carefully considered, ensuring it enhanced the driveway without creating new complications. Karen's rare attempts at confrontation became increasingly humorous in their futility. She tried reversing, inching closer and testing angles only to be stopped by the well-placed planters. There were moments when she left in visible frustration, muttering under her breath, her sense of power diminished. The protagonist observed with calm satisfaction, recognizing that strategic thinking, patience, and composure had neutralized repeated conflict without aggression. Over time, the planters became an accepted and admired part of the neighborhood. Passers-by noticed the vibrant greenery, the thoughtful placement, and the clear boundaries they established. Children played nearby. Adults admired the aesthetic improvement, and the driveway became fully functional and respected. Karen's presence no longer dominated the space, and the neighborhood adapted to the new reality. The protagonist had successfully transformed a source of conflict into a symbol of clever problem-solving and calm assertiveness. The protagonist also reflected on the broader implications of the experience. The lessons learned about patience, creativity, and strategic thinking could be applied to other challenges in life. Confrontation was not always necessary. Preparation, observation, and clever solutions often led to better outcomes. The driveway incident had been a small but meaningful demonstration of how thoughtful action could overcome persistent frustration, turning a difficult situation into an opportunity for empowerment. Karen eventually adjusted her behavior completely. She visited less frequently, made fewer attempts to challenge the protagonist, and gradually accepted that the driveway was no longer an obstacle for her to dominate. The protagonist noticed the change, a subtle relief that the long-standing tension had been resolved. The planters had done more than just protect the driveway. They had created a sense of peace, a boundary that was respected, and a demonstration of the effectiveness of thoughtful problem-solving. The neighborhood continued to admire the driveway and the planters. Conversations often included references to the clever solution, the patience, and the composure demonstrated by the protagonist. It became a quiet lesson in how to handle persistent challenges without conflict, showing that intelligence, preparation, and calm assertiveness could achieve results where anger or complaint often failed. The protagonist's experience became a subtle guide for others facing similar challenges. Throughout this period, the protagonist continued to reflect on personal growth and the importance of boundaries. The driveway, once a source of stress, had become a symbol of empowerment, creativity, and calm authority. The planters were more than physical objects. They were a reminder that patience, planning, and thoughtful action could overcome persistent difficulties and transform challenging situations into opportunities for growth. Life returned to a steady rhythm. The driveway remained secure, the neighborhood peaceful, and Karen's attempts at interference minimal. The protagonist enjoyed the calm, the order, and the satisfaction of a problem resolved through clever, non-confrontational means. Each day brought reassurance, a quiet confidence in the effectiveness of thoughtful action, and a sense of accomplishment in reclaiming control over a previously stressful situation. In the end, the driveway was more than a functional space. It was a testament to the power of preparation, patience, and creativity. The planters had not only solved a practical problem, but it also provided a lasting lesson in handling challenges calmly and effectively. Karen's interference had been neutralized, the neighborhood respected the solution, and the protagonist had achieved a quiet but meaningful victory, one that demonstrated the value of strategic thinking and thoughtful action in overcoming persistent obstacles. The weeks following Karen's final attempts brought a calm that the protagonist had not experienced in months. The driveway, once a battlefield of frustration and anxiety, had become a place of order, beauty, and quiet satisfaction. The massive planters stood firm, filled with vibrant plants, flowers, and greenery that added life and color to the space. It was no longer just a driveway. It was a symbol of patience, creativity, and the quiet power of thoughtful action. Karen, realizing that her usual tactics were ineffective, had begun to accept the reality. She parked further away, avoided confrontational visits, and limited her interference. The protagonist noticed the subtle shift in her behavior and felt a deep sense of relief. There was no longer the constant worry about blocked exits or tense confrontations. The planters had accomplished more than physical protection. They had created boundaries, enforced respect, and restored peace to daily life. Neighbors who had once watched with curiosity and whispered opinions began to admire the driveway transformation. Some commented on the beauty of the plants, others marveled at the strategic placement of the planters, and a few quietly congratulated the protagonist for handling a difficult situation with intelligence and calmness. The driveway became a point of pride, a subtle lesson in how creativity and patience could solve persistent problems without conflict. The protagonist took moments to reflect on the journey. The initial frustration, the repeated confrontations, the careful planning, and the final execution of the planters had taught lessons in resilience and problem-solving. There was satisfaction not only in reclaiming the driveway, but also in learning the value of calm assertiveness. Life had been challenging with Karen's constant interference, but the experience had strengthened the protagonist's ability to handle difficulties thoughtfully and effectively. Daily life became simpler. Leaving for work, running errands, or inviting friends over no longer involved a mental check of whether the driveway would be blocked. The routine became predictable and stress-free. Each time the protagonist stepped outside and saw the planters, there was a quiet reminder that thoughtful action, patience, and planning could transform challenges into solutions. The driveway was now a safe, functional, and visually appealing space. Karen's behavior, once disruptive and exhausting, had changed. She still visited the neighborhood, but her actions were less aggressive and her presence no longer imposed on the protagonist's routine. The planters had shifted the power dynamic entirely. The protagonist had acted strategically and legally, and the results were undeniable. The driveway was respected, boundaries were clear, and daily life flowed with renewed ease. Reflecting on the entire experience, the protagonist realized that the situation had been about more than just a driveway. It had been a test of patience, creativity, and composure. Each step, from initial frustration to careful planning, and finally to execution, had reinforced the importance of handling problems with thoughtfulness and intelligence. The planters were not just objects. They were symbols of resilience, clever problem-solving, and quiet strength. As the neighborhood adapted to the new reality, there was a subtle shift in community dynamics. Neighbors admired the practical solution, some inspired to consider similar approaches to their own minor conflicts. The protagonist had demonstrated that difficult situations did not require anger or confrontation to resolve. Observation, careful planning, and strategic action could produce lasting results. The driveway became a model of how creative solutions could maintain peace while solving persistent problems. The protagonist continued to care for the planters, enjoying the greenery, the flowers, and the satisfaction of maintaining a space that was both functional and beautiful. Gardening became a small joy, a daily reminder of the victory achieved without conflict. The driveway was no longer a source of tension, but a testament to the effectiveness of calm, deliberate action. Occasionally, Karen would pass by, her expression a mixture of acknowledgement and quiet frustration. There were no words, no confrontation, only the understanding that the dynamics had shifted permanently. The protagonist continued life with a sense of calm confidence, knowing that boundaries had been established and respected, and that persistent challenges could be met with intelligence and patience rather than aggression. Friends visiting the house often commented on the planters in the driveway. They admired the beauty, appreciated the clever solution, and laughed at the stories of Karen's futile attempts. The protagonist shared experiences selectively, emphasizing the lessons of patience, strategy, and calm problem-solving. Each story served as both entertainment and insight, illustrating how clever action could transform persistent challenges into opportunities for resolution and growth. The neighborhood, having observed the entire situation, began to respect the protagonist's approach to conflict. There was a subtle understanding that boundaries could be enforced effectively without confrontation. The planters, once a simple practical solution, had become a symbol of thoughtful action and clever problem-solving, earning quiet admiration from all who noticed. Reflecting further, the protagonist realized that the experience had provided personal growth beyond the immediate situation. The ability to handle a difficult, persistent neighbor with intelligence and patience had strengthened confidence and resilience. Life, though sometimes filled with minor frustrations, could be navigated with creativity and composure. The driveway and the planters were a daily reminder of this valuable lesson. Time passed and the planters remained a permanent fixture. The driveway was fully functional, beautiful, and respected. Karen's attempts at interference had ceased and the neighborhood accepted the new normal. The protagonist enjoyed the calm, the order, and the satisfaction of having solved a persistent problem through clever, thoughtful action. Each day, stepping outside and seeing the planters served as a quiet victory, a testament to patience, planning, and resilience. The final reflection was simple yet powerful. The driveway had been reclaimed, boundaries enforced, and peace restored. The planters were not just objects of physical protection, but symbols of intelligence, patience, and the effectiveness of calm, strategic problem-solving. The protagonist had transformed frustration into action, creating a solution that was legal, effective, and admired by the community. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The protagonist could move through daily routines without worry, enjoy moments of peace, and appreciate the clever solution that had restored control. Karen's presence no longer disrupted life, and the neighborhood quietly recognized the effectiveness of the approach. The planters, vibrant and strong, stood as a reminder that persistence, creativity, and calm assertiveness could resolve challenges in meaningful and lasting ways. The story of the driveway and the planters became a quiet legend in the neighborhood, illustrating that patience, observation, and strategic thinking could overcome persistent difficulties. The protagonist had shown that effective problem-solving did not require aggression, only careful thought, creativity, and a steady hand. The driveway was not just a place to park a car. It was a symbol of empowerment, resilience, and the quiet triumph of clever, thoughtful action. Months had passed since the planters had been placed, and life for the protagonist had settled into a calm and predictable rhythm. The driveway remained secure and functional, the greenery vibrant, and the neighborhood had adapted to the new setup. The planters were no longer just physical objects. They had become symbols of resilience, clever thinking, and the quiet assertion of boundaries. The protagonist often reflected on how much had changed, realizing that patience and planning had created lasting peace where frustration had once dominated. One morning, as the protagonist stepped outside with a cup of coffee, there was a small feeling of pride. Looking at the driveway, the bright plants, and the careful arrangement of the planters, there was a sense of satisfaction that went beyond aesthetics. Each day, the driveway symbolized a victory achieved without aggression, a triumph of intelligence over stubbornness, and the power of preparation over impulsive confrontation. Even Karen, who had once dominated the space with her sense of entitlement, had started to appear less frequently. She parked further down the street and spoke less to neighbors about the driveway. There was a shift in her attitude, subtle but noticeable, as if she had begun to understand that her old methods of asserting control no longer worked. The protagonist observed these changes calmly, noting that time and consistency had reinforced the effectiveness of the planters. There was no need for further confrontation. The results were evident. Neighbors, too, had begun to appreciate the driveway and the planters. Some would pause during walks to admire the arrangement, comment on the vibrant greenery, or ask for advice on their own landscaping. The protagonist realized that the planters had unintentionally become a model of creative problem-solving and peaceful boundary enforcement. The story of the driveway and Karen's attempts had traveled quietly through the neighborhood, becoming a subtle legend that illustrated how clever, thoughtful action could solve persistent problems. Life's routines became smoother. The protagonist could leave the house without the worry of confrontation, return from errands without frustration, and enjoy the simple pleasure of a tidy, beautiful driveway. Even small tasks like washing the car or planting seasonal flowers carried a sense of empowerment. Each moment reinforced the lesson that preparation, calmness, and intelligence could overcome repeated challenges without escalating tension. One afternoon, while tending to the planters, the protagonist noticed Karen walking by. She smiled politely, and Karen, for once, returned the gesture without any trace of annoyance or confrontation. It was a small but significant moment, an acknowledgement that the dynamics had changed permanently. The protagonist felt satisfaction not from superiority or revenge, but from the peace that had been restored. The driveway was now a space of calm, boundaries were respected, and previous frustrations had been replaced by confidence and control. The protagonist began sharing gardening tips and advice with interested neighbors. Conversations became lighthearted and enjoyable, a stark contrast to the tension that had existed months before. The driveway had not only been a battleground, but had become a platform for building subtle community connections and inspiring creative solutions to everyday challenges. The protagonist took pride in the quiet influence this had created, understanding that thoughtful action often spoke louder than words. Karen's rare visits served as reminders of the past difficulties, but each encounter was calmer than the last. She seemed to have shifted her perspective, perhaps realizing that the driveway was no longer a space for her to dominate. The protagonist observed her quietly, without confrontation, acknowledging that time and consistency had played as much a role as the planters themselves. There was a sense of resolution in these small interactions, a confirmation that patience and strategy could transform challenging relationships. The protagonist also reflected on personal growth throughout this experience. The months of dealing with frustration, planning solutions, and executing a thoughtful strategy had strengthened confidence, resilience, and composure. Life had tested patience, but it had also demonstrated that intelligence, creativity, and calm assertiveness could achieve meaningful results. The driveway and the planters were daily reminders of these lessons, a living testament to the power of clever problem-solving. The vibrant greenery of the planters required occasional care, but the protagonist found joy in this task. Watering, pruning, and adding seasonal flowers became small rituals of satisfaction. Each plant represented not only beauty, but the effectiveness of foresight and planning. The driveway, once a source of stress, had become a space of quiet empowerment where careful, thoughtful action had produced lasting harmony. Neighbors occasionally asked about the story behind the planters, curious about the effort and thought that had gone into the arrangement. The protagonist would smile, sharing lessons on planning, patience, and non-confrontational problem-solving. The narrative became a subtle teaching moment, showing that challenges could be overcome without anger or escalation. It reinforced the idea that intelligence, observation, and strategy were often more effective than confrontation. Life settled into a comfortable routine. The driveway was secure, Karen's interference was minimal, and the neighborhood had adjusted to the new reality. The protagonist could focus on daily tasks, relationships, and personal projects without the looming stress of confrontation. Each morning, stepping outside to see the vibrant greenery and well-placed planters was a reminder of the victory achieved through careful thought and calm action. Occasionally, Karen would attempt a small, subtle test of boundaries, perhaps parking a little closer on the street or making a mild comment. Each time, the protagonist responded calmly and consistently, reinforcing the effectiveness of the planters and the established boundaries. These interactions became brief and almost routine, a reminder that consistent, thoughtful action could manage even the most persistent challenges. The protagonist also realized that the driveway situation had broader implications for handling life's challenges. Patience.